one of the things that's taken me a while to get comfortable with is that the transfer literature is coming out of a lot of different disciplinary perspectives, right? There's work in cognitive psychology, there's work in education, there's work in math that's fantastic, that teaches us a lot. There's actually a lot of research on transfer in human resources, which is sort of new news to me. And I think there are moments when I sort of want, the key to all mythologies, I want it all to fit together. And sort of allowing ourselves to feel comfortable with the fact that what we're in the process of doing is trying to figure out what are the frames, what are the vocabularies, what are the theoretical frameworks, and they don't all fit together nicely. And there are these moments of great sort of confusion and frustration because a lot of times we're using the same language, so it feels like we should, in rhetorical theory, right, we should be in stasis. We should be really communicating clearly. And it's not always happening. But I think that's part of the work of doing this multidisciplinary project and bringing all these different disciplines to bear.
One domain of research that I think is really useful is situated cognition. Of course, this comes out of psychology. But there's been quite a bit of work done on how people learn, not just writing, but other kinds of learning in various settings. And I think that's a good place to start, just to be able to understand some of the groundwork and some of the terms that people have used, some of the concepts people have developed to help us think about things like the distance between contexts, the distance between the challenges that people face when they're learning, or the objects of learning, how unfamiliar. And so when we ask those questions as teachers of writing or scholars of writing, we're asking to define distance in interesting and new ways. So that would be one domain. I think the psychological domain is very useful.
While Perkins and Salomon are often cited and have been important for me, some of the work in the National Research Council's How People Learn has been very important for me because it has helped me to think about questions that I'm finding compelling and haven't quite figured out how to address, some of which I mentioned earlier. Questions like, what's the relationship between expertise and a role within a particular context or community and metacognitive awareness? So that set of work and discussions of metacognition in relation to expertise have been really important for me.
One reading that I still find to be highly generative is the National Research Council volume, How People Learn. And I think I find it so useful because it draws from multiple disciplines, because it connects to K-12, because it is predicated on the notion that we can teach for transfer, that there are things we can do to facilitate transfer for students. And it's committed to the idea that all of us as learners at some level are novices. And so we're all engaged in transfers. It's not, when I say students, I don't just mean the 21-year-old sitting in my class, I actually mean all of us. So there's a construction of human learning as an activity that resonates for me.
I think probably cultural historical activity theory has been the guiding theory for me when I've been thinking about transfer, because it helps us think not only about the individual, but also the context, not only the present, but also history. And I think that that's been very helpful. But recently, I've also been thinking about Bourdieu and ideas about disposition and habitus as helpful. I'm still not totally sure how they're helpful, but I feel like they help me think about the issues of transfer in a slightly different way than I'd been thinking about them up before.
Activity theory gives us the language of the double bind, this moment where when you sense things in conflict between those systems, some people will shut down. Some people will find it impossible to figure out how to move forward with that. But the double bind, the other side of that double bind is it can become a moment where you recognize that these things are in conflict, that they're not necessarily natural or inevitable, and that can become this incredible opportunity for expansive learning. And that concept of the double bind has been incredibly helpful for me in thinking about what's going on for individuals in the process of transfer writ large.
One or two writing theories or theories of learning that have really shaped my work are, one, the idea of threshold concepts. So these are concepts that are critical for epistemological participation within disciplines. And this comes out of work done by Jan Meyer and Ray Land, who are some British educational theorists. They were looking at economics and a little bit at history. In my work, I've really been thinking about composition or writing studies, and also at history. But I've also started to think about threshold concepts in disciplines across the university, particularly in the context of general education, which is really what I'm interested in. Another really important learning concept for me has been this idea of communities of practice that comes out of Levin Wenger's work. And it's important to me. That's not a new theory, of course. And threshold concepts has been around for a little while. What's so useful for me about communities of practice is the idea that there are practices that exist within communities, that there are novices and experts who participate in this practice, but that learning how to learn about the practices is a really critical part of participation in those communities. And that's what's so helpful for me as I think about the ways students move among different communities of practice.
One of the things I've been looking at recently is a series of articles that come from the two-year college environment. And in particular, they're not all in teaching English in the two-year college, but many of them are there. And there's one that, as editor of College Composition and Communication, which I edit, that journal is the flagship journal in writing studies. We just published an article in the June issue of the journal. And in this article by Michelle Clary Navarre, she looks at two students who've been in and out of school, so they're swirling. That's the language, I think, in the higher ed literature. And they've been in the workplace. There's one in particular who's given himself the name Doppel. And he's just extraordinarily interesting in terms of his sense of self-efficacy, in terms of his ability to take what he's learned about writing as a practice from the multiple sites where he's written. So, for example, at the point that she's authoring this article, I think Doppel is somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 years old. He does outline as a writer, which is not something a lot of us in writing studies are a fan of, but that's what he does. And he learned it in middle school. So he harkens back 20 years, basically, for a practice that he found helpful. He also has worked as a draftsman in an architectural firm. And in terms of how he organizes his writing, he thinks in terms of architectural blocks of prose. So he's got a visual idea of how the text is going to lay out. So he's drawing that from the workplace. And I could go on, I will spare you. But what I like about this, in contrast to the NRC, which is broad in scope, multidisciplinary, multi-sided. What I like about the Doppel study is that it's very rich in detail. It's got a lot of depth. It's narrow, of course, but it gives us a very finely grained picture of how people carry forward what they've learned in lots of different sites to try to create the practice that they engage in now. And when you put two pieces of literature like that together, you get breadth and you get depth, and I think then you have a better sense of what this phenomenon is that we're trying to understand and then work with in terms of our own teaching practice.
Haskell, spirit of transfer is a really useful concept because it assumes this mindset. Even Salmon and Perkins have the mindful abstraction. I think there's some really interesting work in activity theory that can help us understand that. And so what I'm trying to do, and actually Salmon and Perkins just came out with a new piece talking about dispositional qualities of transfer, which has been wonderful, because that's really, to me, it's like, for a while we were like, okay, it's all in the classroom, and then maybe we're like, okay, it's all in the context, and then there's this group saying, okay, it's all in the individual. And what I'm trying to look at, and I think a lot of us are now, is how do we bridge those different things? How do we bring these theories together that give us a more well-rounded picture? So one of the things that's been really influential in my work also is on Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model, which takes a look at things like time, it looks at dispositions, it looks at context, it looks at a learning environment, and it brings all these factors together. And then as a researcher, I can say, okay, these are the factors that matter, but I only have 7,500 words to describe this, so I'm going to take a look at this factor, but just be aware that these other things are happening.